My name is Ovijit Kosh. On behalf of the University of Illinois system, I'm delighted to welcome you, and I thank you for attending the symposium organized by the UFI Press. Presses play a critical role at universities such as ours by highlighting the scholarly work of our faculty and researchers. Through the books, series, and journals, the press creates access and visibility of that scholarly work to a broad audience. It also facilitates connections and collaborations among researchers at different universities and provides professional development opportunities for faculty and students. Through events such as this, the press helps faculty build connections with each other across institutions and disciplinary lines. The press also plays a critical role by integrating new research frameworks and methods to allow new questions, perspectives, and voices to infuse and guide scholarly discourse and seek out new voices that tell different stories. Today's topic is especially relevant in creating tomorrow's universities by focusing on countering bias in scholarly research and practicing inclusive publishing. They're both important issues to maintaining the fidelity of honest scholarship. I want to thank our panelists today for agreeing to lead these discussions. I know they'll be thought-provoking and insightful. Thank you for your help, and thank you to all of you for attending today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Matheson, the director of the University of Illinois Press, and I also want to add my welcome to everyone here, the panelists, and to all of you tuning in from places far and near. I'm really grateful to our panelists today, Jennifer Barkley, Toby Beauchamp, and Lisa Mercer. Our chair is momentarily not with us, and so we're going to move ahead with the panel, though, and Jennifer's going to take the lead in introducing the panelists and kind of helping move the discussion along through some questions that they've developed together. And then we'll leave some time toward the end of the session to address your questions, and our coordinator, Heather Gernitz, will be moderating that discussion. So without any further ado, let's move forward, and thank you once again, everyone, for being here.
Thank you for that, Lori. And thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to the Against the Grain, Recognizing and Countering Bias in Scholarly Research panel. I'm Jennifer Barkley. I am an assistant professor at the University at Buffalo, and I'm an affiliate faculty member of the Gender Institute here at UB. I'm also an associate editor for the Review of Disability Studies, an international journal, and I'm the author of my recent book, The Mark of Slavery, Disability, Race, and Gender in Antebellum America, that was published with the University of Illinois Press last year, just about a year ago. And I'm joined with my fellow panelists, Toby Beauchamp, who is an associate professor of gender and women's studies and an affiliate faculty in the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is the author of Going Stealth, Transgender Politics and U.S. Surveillance Practices, that was published with Duke University Press in 2019. And our final panelist today is Lisa Mercer. She is a designer, educator, and researcher in the School for Art and Design at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She co-developed the framework Racism Untaught, a framework for identifying racialized design and critically assessing anti-racist design approaches. So I'm really excited to be here. I know the panelists and I had several conversations leading up to today, and we had sort of come up with some questions that we thought we would discuss amongst ourselves, but just pertaining to issues relevant to today's panel. And we figured, the first part of our session, we would just organize it more almost as a roundtable, as a conversation, and then we'll invite some questions from the audience in the last, 15 minutes or so of our time with you all today. So with that said, I want to start the panel off by just asking, a sort of basic question of my panelist members about what it means to each of you individually to sort of produce and publish research that is against the grain. So I don't know if Toby or Lisa, if you want to jump in, but that was just our sort of broad question for starting. Like, what does it mean to publish and produce work that is against the grain?
I can take it first. So when I moved back into academia in 2013, I had been in industry for about 15 years, and I was so focused on, I was a website and mobile app developer. So I was really focused on, creating products that were meant to be consumed. And I really wanted to shift that perspective. And so when I shifted it back into academia, for me, it wasn't about doing something necessarily against the grain, but creating work and focusing on research that I was passionate about, that I could see myself doing and just being really happy about, just really learning and continuously teaching what I'm learning. And so that was really my approach. And one of the things that I really like about being in academia is you get to go to conferences, and you get to be a part of panels and meet wonderful people like you both. And I love the titles that they give us, because it almost teaches me something about how others see my research. So I was looking at it against the grain, and I thought, oh, I guess what I do is you kind of forget I'm so entrenched in what I do that sometimes I forget the outside perception of my work. And so I really appreciated the title. Anyway, Toby, I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, and thanks, Jennifer, for stepping in to moderate this. When I was thinking about this question, it made me think about a book that I think I keep going back to with this in mind, which is Linda Tuhiwai Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies. It's maybe 20 plus years old now, but I still use it in my teaching and to think about my own research practices. And she begins by showing how research has been used as a tool for Western imperialism against Indigenous people. And these ideas about objectivity and expertise and how those have been wielded in harmful ways. But she also goes on to guide her readers to think about how to decolonize research and to do it differently. And some of that begins right at the start with thinking about the assumptions that might be built into our research questions. What do gender and race actually mean? What does land mean? Is time actually linear, right? What about this investment in ranking things or systems of classification or hierarchies, right, that have guided so much research that's been sort of codified as academic research? And so for me, I think researching and writing against the grain has to do sort of at its core with supporting and citing multiple forms of knowledge production that often don't align with these assumptions about what count as valid methods or valid sources that have commonly, structured academic work. And then I'll say also that I think this for me has to do with a kind of citational practice as well, and a kind of politics of citation around whose knowledge counts and whose forms of language count as publishable work and work that is worthy. I was thinking about being a graduate student so my primary field is transgender studies. And when I was a grad student, it was still a very new field and there were very few people publishing in it and even fewer actual trans people publishing in it. And I remember a book was published then by a major feminist theorist who made an important argument about how trans people have navigated medical institutions. But I read it and thought, well, trans people have been talking about this for decades though, right? But we just haven't been published on it. So, I think sometimes those citational practices are really important. Like, am I going to cite this major theorist, or am I going to cite her plus these community organizations or individuals who have been creating this knowledge all along, right? So I think those kinds of, even if things like community groups and activist projects are not considered scholarly sources, I think going against the grain means taking them seriously and engaging them as we would any other kind of source.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of your responses, and I actually found, something in each of them that really resonated with me. I know, Lisa, when you said you were just sort of, don't really think about yourself necessarily like doing work that's against the grain. I can really relate to that because I always tell my students, they'll ask me like how I came into the fields that I work in terms of disability history and African-American history and women's and gender history. And I always tell them like it wasn't some, sort of strategic plan that I had as an undergraduate student or an MA student. Like I really just followed my gut and my interests and the things that I was passionate about and the things that, like really mattered to me, that I felt like I could do work in that might actually make a difference. So I just sort of followed my interests and my passions, and that sort of brought me to working with really wonderful people and just doing really amazing research. So I'm really grateful for those kinds of opportunities. And when you said that, Lisa, it really resonated with me. But as far as what Toby said, I totally agree with you as well, that for me, when I think about like what it means to do work that is against the grain, for me, it's about sort of challenging standard kind of dominant narratives. I'm a historian, so for me, it's about kind of challenging those dominant narratives in history that have all, for so long been dominated by certain kinds of voices and certain kinds of sources and, like published, sources or archival like materials that are, documented, that are favored over things like oral histories or, right, like sort of voices from the bottom up. So that is such an important thing to me, to think about how to center the perspectives of marginalized people who are from vulnerable communities and from communities that haven't been, represented in historical narratives previously. So trying to kind of add that sort of layer. And thinking about the kinds of questions that I ask too, trying to ask questions, Toby, you said like, what is time? Like, what is like thinking about those assumptions that really determine the kinds of questions that we ask when we read and when we just enter into a research project, I think are really, really fundamental. So I really like totally identify, I guess, with both of your responses in different ways. So I appreciate that. I don't know if we can maybe pivot a little bit to sort of speak to this issue of how to navigate things like silences and absences, gaps in primary source materials, or what it means for us as researchers to sort of study primary source materials like as we're producing them. I think those are both really good questions that again sort of speak to the power dynamics of doing research and scholarship that tries to work against the grain. And maybe this time I'll sort of go first and jump in and then hand it over to you all. But I thought a lot about this question because this issue of how to navigate like the absences and the silences in primary sources, is something that is, occupied my mind for more than a decade. When I worked on my first book, I was writing about the experiences of enslaved people with disabilities. So, scholars of slavery already know that we have a very limited sort of primary source, archive in many ways when we're thinking about, enslaved people and their perspectives. So to add that, the other layer of, disability onto enslaved people's experiences meant that I was working against, two like factors that really limited people's voices in traditional archives. So this is something I've thought about a lot and worked around quite a bit in my work. And for me, I thought of things and used things in my scholarship like sort of informed speculation. Sometimes you don't have the answers, but you can make informed, guesses, or you can paint a picture that allows folks to sort of imagine what might have been, or like what was likely the reality for folks. I used one source in my research. It was a court case, actually. It was about an enslaved man. His name was never even mentioned, and they never really spoke about any of his sort of experiences or thoughts about what was happening. But it was a case involving property. Enslaved people were viewed as property, and this man had been disabled while he was hired out to someone else, and the person who was the slaveholder like sued this person for damage to her quote unquote property. So it was this really disturbing case, and I never knew this man's name. All I knew was that he had become blind as a result of this injury that he sustained. And, while the court case sort of talked about him as an object, as property, for me, like I was thinking, wow, like what must this have been like for this man to, he became completely blind as a result of this injury and was removed from the community of folks that he had lived with. So I could speculate, right, as to what that must have been like for him in some ways. And that using those kinds of tactics and strategies was useful for me, as well as just sort of thinking about how to use sources that were intended for other audiences, but to read them against the grain, to see what they could tell me about the folks I was interested in. So reading, sources from medical journals and things like that, where folks were being diagnosed, and it was this very clinical language, right? But inadvertently, a lot of times physicians, when publishing their work, would tell me a lot of, information about the enslaved people who they saw as patients. But, by reading that source against the grain, I was able to kind of flesh out additional information about them. So I think there are so many different strategies and, methodologies and things that we can employ to really address this kind of issue in research.
I super appreciate what you everything you just said, Jennifer, about having to deal with sources that are so incomplete and so filtered through dominant viewpoints. I encounter this in my own research all the time because, in trans studies, there are a lot of silences and also what I might generously call translations of, where trans people are technically present in medical or legal records, but we know those institutions to be coercive and disciplinary. And so we have to approach those records with a lot of skepticism. And also many trans people don't even have access to those institutions. And so the voices that are there, as mediated as they are, still are not representative. But, thinking about what you said, Jennifer, it was reminding me of, I'll practice my own good citational politics right now, but it was reminding me of two models that I like to turn to around, these gaps in the primary sources. And one of them is Saidiya Hartman's article, Venus in Two Acts, which I used to teach all the time, where she's grappling with exactly what you said, the sort of impossibility of really knowing anything with certainty or clarity about enslaved people, because the records that we have are basically records of their eradication, right? They're records of them as merely disposable or of being disappeared. And so, she does not want her own research and writing to then repeat that kind of violence and disappearing. So, the whole article is really helpful to me because instead of trying to make up a voice for people that she can't actually know, or trying to excavate some, facts that are not actually there and can't be there unmediated, she just sort of names these as impossible stories, and she turns those questions back on the archive itself. So the whole essay is really a question not of the people that are missing so much, but more the question of our reliance on an archive and she really encourages us to not take archives as transparent facts. So I think that is one strategy for addressing absences. And then the other article I'll mention that I think is helpful is a piece by Jules Gill-Peterson called Trans of Color Critique Before Transsexuality, that looks at medical records in the 1930s about the medical studies on trans people. And when she's researching, she finds only one record of a person of color that was studied. And it's incomplete because the person refused to comply with the medical researcher's protocol and then sort of left the study, right? So it's a very partial account. But instead of dismissing it or making assumptions about it, she sort of changes the whole approach of her article to just be about this one scrap of a case. And she looks very carefully at this Black trans person's refusals, right? And she kind of focuses in on the unknowability of this person, right? And instead of thinking of it as, oh, this was a missed opportunity, if only I knew more about this person, I could really write this article. It's actually the person's refusal to be seen by the medical researchers and refusal to comply that is so compelling to Gill-Peterson as an author. Because for her, it's that, unknowability and unintelligibility to medicine that actually like subverts medicine's authority, right? Like she's like, this person refused to comply. And so medicine no longer had its expertise and authority to stand on. And so for her, that's the crux of it. So I think one of the compelling strategies for me in dealing with absences has been to not necessarily try super hard to find what's missing, but to really pay attention to what might be in the silences and what that tells us about the institutions that have created and maintain those silences, right? So I'll try to put those two pieces in the chat so that people have the citations, but I do find them very helpful as models.
Yeah, that's so useful. I'm sitting here nodding my head because everything you're saying just resonates with me so much. I don't know the second source that you're talking about, but now I really want to read it. Speaking of citational practices, I should mention too that a lot of my understanding of these things, comes from folks like Marissa Fuentes, her book Dispossessed Lives, that deals with enslaved women and just the sort of violence of archives, right, that erase people. And, but I think it's absolutely critical, what you said, Toby, about not trying to, write from a, like add a voice and imagine an entire voice or a situation. Like sometimes what the archives don't tell us is incredibly important, for what they do reveal about power and power dynamics and, whose voices are included and whose are ignored, whose are marginalized or erased. There's a lot to unpack with that kind of stuff. Did you want to jump in, Lisa?
Absolutely. Yes, it absolutely resonates with me what you both are saying, because one of the largest parts of our research is the new shared language that we get to create with the people and the participants in our workshops. And to me, this was something that I didn't expect to be so generative from our workshops, was this idea that there was like this epistemic injustice of not even having the language to describe an experience or to then share it and to disseminate it even in a scholarly way. And so finding the language, and not even just finding it ourselves, but then finding definitions that aren't through the lens of white supremacy, that actually explain, a very racialized or racist experience. And so that is something that we have found ways to sort of fill the silence, and seeing people find agency in that language, something as simple as a word, has been really impactful in the work that we do. So I think part of it is the shared language, but also the definitions, making sure that we are defining it in a way that speaks to the participants in our workshops who especially identify as a person of color. And then through the discussions with them, we are able to be iterative in those definitions that we are creating. So I absolutely agree with the idea that trying to find those ways of filling the silence, but also trying to find the ways that decenter whiteness in the definitions of those racist experiences. Yeah.
Did you want to jump in with anything else, Toby? I mean, I'm sitting here thinking too about even just, sort of theory and the role of theory in this, thinking about intersectionality, thinking about, like, for me as a disability scholar, like the tension between like embodiment and like social constructivism and those kinds of things, but they are very generative and productive. And one thing that I really appreciated about what you said, Lisa, is something I think about all the time, which is like our responsibility as researchers to, be accountable to people, right, who belong to communities of folks of whom we write about and who we do our research about. And, I'm really inspired by folks like Susan Birch, a disability historian who recently published a book dealing with asylums, in Indigenous communities, and but like working with Indigenous people and being accountable to them in the work that she did. Like, I think that's so crucial. And it reminds me of another topic that we had talked about in terms of like, what are the kinds of things that researchers can do to try to sort of minimize or reverse the kinds of biases that, have for so long really kind of shaped the kinds of work that we do. So maybe that would be a good segue for us. Like that question of accountability, I think, is certainly one of them. Like it's something that should be in the forefront of people's minds. But I don't know, maybe Toby, did you want to jump in, or did you have more that you wanted to add to that, Lisa?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, sorry, I got a little lost at the end. The question is about what researchers can do to try to minimize or turn back bias and
yeah, that's the question is, what can researchers do to try to minimize or reverse bias in publishing?
It's so, all day today I've been, this panel's been on my mind, and I've also been thinking about the news from the Supreme Court last night, I guess the pre-news news, and then, the fact that there are protests happening right now all over the country, including here in Champaign, Urbana. And I was thinking about how challenging it is as a researcher to publish on topics that are considered controversial or, risky topics, which, in my case might be trans rights. We've been talking a lot about racial justice, questions about, abortion, and just thinking about, the real risk that I think a lot of people who work on those topics have to take when we write and publish work that is challenging the status quo and addressing that kind of supposedly risky. I mean, to me, it doesn't feel risky, but I think it is risky kind of subject matter, right? And so I think that is dangerous sometimes in terms of our job security, especially for junior scholars and students. But given the attacks on tenure, maybe even for tenured people now, right? But also I think dangerous in terms of our daily lives, knowing that if we publish on these things that we may be surveilled, we may be targeted, and especially if we are in marginalized groups already, then we have fewer protections in our workplace and fewer protections in our community or our state. So I think that kind of chilling effect, right, also limits the pool of people that we can cite, because it feels dangerous to work on these things. So then it becomes a cycle, right, that there are fewer people to cite, and then the fewer people there are, the more who are publishing on it are targeted, right? So I think one of the things that, researchers can do to try to turn this back is to really form strong support for, especially for junior scholars and for students who have fewer protections, right? Really thinking about the presses and publishers and editors who to be ethical, who to be supportive of this kind of work, and helping network other scholars with those people, so that you're connecting them with people who have a track record of publishing work that is pushing boundaries in these ways, right? But I also think it's about being frank with our students and with people who have less experience publishing about how these things traditionally work, so that everyone understands. I think that publishing feels, for me, it has always felt really opaque. You know, like I didn't really know what I was doing, especially with the book publication process. And so I think the more that we can demystify that process for people and then help them strategize the ways that they want to maneuver within that context, so that they feel safe and supported, but also able to do the kind of research that feels right for them, right? I think, again, practicing good citational politics in our own writing and supporting our students and our mentees in doing so. And then I guess I was also wondering if this question might open some space for thinking about things like how we approach peer reviews, how we approach hiring criteria, how we approach tenure and promotion criteria. You know, how can we organize for more institutional support for people whose, you know, research questions, writing style, methodologies are otherwise dismissed or rejected or not taken seriously because they don't conform to these expectations about what counts as formal scholarship. Right? So those are just some ideas.
Yeah,
Some of the
there's a
things
lot
you
there,
said-
so much to talk about. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah. Now, some of the things that you said, Toby, or everything you said, I absolutely agree with, but some of the things really spoke to me are the idea of who we write with and who we engage with in our scholarly disseminations. So when we were looking for publishers for Racism Untaught, we didn't want to be like the one book on racism and they could say, hey, we are anti-racist, we have this book, you know? And so it was really important for us to be a part of a larger catalog that really supported our book, because we wanted to point to other authors and say, look, we are going to complement each other. We're going to engage with each other's research and support each other in this community of designers and researchers who are anti-racist. And so that was something that was really important to me. And I think I'm looking at the publisher and what else they're publishing. And then also the other thing that you mentioned was, and you mentioned it before as well, but I just think it's important to reiterate, is who we cite. I know for us, it's really intentional, again, to engage with scholars who are doing this work, who are not getting the number of acceptance into journals. And so the more that I can cite the authors who I know whose voices are being silenced, I am so happy to support, because to me, this is something that we need to do is, you know, as we're moving forward through academia, is reaching back to those junior scholars is really important.
Yeah, those are such great points. I've thought, like, you know, been thinking about this panel kind of all day too, and thinking about different ways that I might respond to this question of, you know, like, what are things that we can do as researchers to try to minimize this sort of bias. And I too was thinking about like ways that we can build sort of stronger communities and communities of support. Citational practices was something that immediately came to mind for me. But I was also thinking too about things like, you know, like academics often serve in, you know, positions as editors for, you know, anthologies and collections or special volumes of a journal, and like being mindful of who is sort of taking on those roles, but also like, you know, what kind of like who's being recruited, you know, into these sorts of who's being invited into them, who's being, you know, like I think that's incredibly important because it's a way to, you know, hopefully add more voices. But I was also, you know, like you said, Lisa, I always, you know, I tell students and so many people, you know, I always say there's a difference between saying, you know, to sort of celebrate diversity and, you know, I mean, it's such a, like a bland kind of thing as opposed to dealing with power, right? Like, and the way that power is manifested in whatever, like different projects that we're working on, but the way that gets sort of articulated around race, disability, gender, class, you know, sexuality, all sorts of things, like is so important. So I really appreciated your comment about like looking and seeking out presses that are intentional in terms of their catalog, and, you know, that it's not just some token work on anti-racism or something that gets published. Because then it, you know, it really does deflate, I think, that kind of movement, that momentum that comes out of projects like that whenever we allow that to happen. And the last thing I wanted to mention too is just thinking as a researcher and thinking about building these kinds of communities and you know, who we're involving in different projects and being intentional about that. Like, I also think it's really important to recognize the fact that, you know, a lot of like underrepresented, you know, faculty and, you know, folks who are doing work in communities and activists, et cetera, like they already shoulder so much invisible labor. Like, I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that too, and either to find ways to try to minimize that or to recognize it, you know, to actually think about, you know, compensation and like some of these like really significant questions that I think are part of ethical publishing standards that need to be discussed. Again, just in terms of thinking about unpaid labor and stuff like that. But I don't know, Isabel, did you want to jump in? Isabel's joined us now, and she, I know I might turn things over to her to.
Again, I apologize. I did not have the link on my calendar, so it totally went above my, just over my head, and I had a medical procedure today, so I'm not the sharpest knife in the bunch. So what question are you on?
So right now we're talking about things that researchers can do to try to minimize or reverse bias in publishing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So, yeah, I mean, I think the only thing, and I apologize because I came in towards the end of Toby's comments. The only thing that I might add to what's already been said is that one way to break down structures of power within publishing, whether it be at the, you know, at the journal level and certainly at the publisher level, is just to be reviewers, to review other people's work, to make yourself available as an expert. You know, if they don't have people there who are mindful of issues of equity, of issues of marginalization, of power and structure, those people they're not going to be able to review your book. They're not going to be able to review your articles. So, you know, it's really important to have, I think, volunteer. It's volunteer at this point, not paid, but that's a really critical service that really acts as a gateway. And we know the research tells us that. You know, a journal can only be as diverse as its editorial board and as its editorial reviewers, and the same for both publishers. So anyways, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
Could I just add a couple of comments to things that
of course,
people
you're
have
the
said,
panelist.
including yours, Isa. So I wanted to say I really appreciated Lisa's comment about you know, looking at the publisher and seeing what other things they're publishing and how your work would sit alongside those. But it also made me think that I think this is part of what I meant about retooling our criteria for tenure and promotion and our sort of standards is, you know, there are a lot of press that, I'm sorry, I'm kind of blanking. The only one that's coming to mind now is South End Press, but there are a lot of presses that publish really amazing books on social justice work that are really pushing the boundaries and doing important political work. And but those often are not considered worthy presses when it comes to tenure and promotion, right? So I think part of this conversation, I mean, maybe this bleeds over into the next panel about publishing more specifically, but I think part of the conversation also is about, you know, where we're going to publish and where we think counts as a worthy publication venue. You know, if we're really serious about moving against the grain and breaking down this kind of bias, then we have to think about the kinds of venues that we want to count, right? And then I totally agree with what Isabel said about peer reviewing. And I wanted to add that I think that part of that too is, you know, it seems to me that this academic value system is super insidious. And so even if we know ourselves to be committed to supporting work by marginalized scholars and who are working against the grain, I have found for myself that I have to continually remind myself, like, oh, it's okay for this person to use these sources that don't seem, you know, immediately legit within academia, right? Or oh, this person's using a different writing style that's not super formal, right? But that that, right? So it's just when you're in the institution for so long, its value systems continue to try to seep in. And so as reviewers, I think it's part of our job too to, yes, make ourselves available and do that work, but also to keep reminding ourselves of the kind of principles that we want to review by. I know that I have to do that all the time, and I really want to stay committed to that. So.
Oh gosh, Toby, I think that's such a good point. The idea of reviewing and then having your work reviewed by somebody who has enough knowledge to give you the critical feedback that you really need. Because I know for me, like I love receiving feedback, especially from somebody who has an understanding of the research that I'm doing and is able to appreciate it from a theoretical perspective. Because like when we were looking for publishers, we would hear a lot like, oh, can this be a how-to book? And we were talking about like theory behind anti-racist work, and they weren't able to appreciate the theoretical underpinning of that work. They were so focused on how do I be anti-racist instead of helping other researchers then see the theoretical underpinning of our work so they could too build from it. So I think what you're saying about peer review is it's so important.
Yeah, I think, yeah, back off of both of those comments too, like the idea of the sort of standards against which we judge different things. And yeah, I think it's also really important to think about language and accessibility. And, I feel like that goes along with Toby's point, especially in terms of just making the work that we are producing and putting out into the world, like accessible to a broad audience and not necessarily just writing for other academics, which again, it is hard to do if you are an academic and you're trying to attain tenure, or you're that you're going to be evaluated with a certain set of criteria that doesn't necessarily value or prize that kind of accessibility. Yet it's still really critically important. And having these conversations, with graduate students, with junior faculty and other folks, I think is also really, really important to just shine a light on like all these insidious ways that these things sort of operate and the kinds of consequences that they can have in terms of people's careers and things like that. So I think this is so important.
Mm-hmm. So did you talk about, did you discuss the questions on primary source materials yet?
Yeah, I think we sort of started off with those, and I feel like, we have a couple other questions we didn't necessarily respond to, but I know that we also wanted to take questions. I don't know if there's anything else the other panelists want to add, or, we also talked about what publishers might do to try to minimize bias. Like we talked a little bit about what we as researchers might do, but maybe suggestions for what publishers could do, or even just, personal experiences in terms of getting our own research published, like what if we've encountered different kinds of bias. And I think that's an important question too. That's one that I actually thought quite a bit about. As someone who works in, the history of disability, I feel like that was a challenge for me at different points, right? Like it's about sometimes being able to even just educate people who might not, have an awareness of some of the dynamics of your field. And, I think that folks might be, sometimes, at least with disability history, what I've seen, or disability studies in general, is that sometimes folks don't think about it as necessarily a really serious or legitimate kind of field of academic inquiry, because they don't understand that it's, sort of thinking about disability as a category of analysis and not just, like a fluff piece about, people with disabilities or something like that, the way they might be envisioning. So there's a process of having to educate folks even about the work that you're doing, so that they can see, like the value of it and the validity of it as an academic and scholarly topic. So that's something that I feel like, and for me, it's meant looking for welcoming spaces and welcoming presses and folks who actually get it, right? Like trying to seek out those kinds of spaces to publish my work in. But I don't know if, if Lisa or Toby wanted to respond to that, and then maybe we could turn to some questions.
I was just thinking that I've tried, with a lot of support from good mentors, I've tried to be really strategic in where I submitted my work for publication. Working in trans studies, until recently, there were not that many venues. And so you have to be careful about where you submit. And because it means what kind of reviews you're going to get, what kind of support you'll get from the editorial staff, et cetera. And so I have been very strategic, and it mostly has worked out well, but I will say that sometimes the snags come with things like in the copy editing process, right? There are a lot of corrections made to pronouns or other terminology that is standard in my field, right? Or is respectful for the people I'm referencing, but the copy editor is going by other kinds of standards. And so, you know, this might also, I mean, I'm a little outside my lane because I don't work in publishing, but I think, you know, maybe that is something to think about, like who you contract with for copy edits and other kinds of work that you might contract out, or how you're training different staff to you know, navigate different kinds of submissions and different topics. Because as an author, then I have to do a lot of education, and that's, I don't think that, you know, that's the stage where people should have to do that. And I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't want my students or mentees to have to do that, certainly as new authors. So yeah, so that's one thing. And then the other thing I was thinking about with publishing is I was thinking about the importance of open access publishing and thinking about people who are shut out from institutional access, who still need access to research that is super hard to get if you don't have connections to an academic library. So, you know, I think having those conversations about access more broadly, and then maybe also thinking about disability studies and disability politics, like how are we going to publish things so that they are truly accessible by a number of different people, you know, and maybe not just the sort of traditional formats, right? So those kinds of access questions I think are also important, but again, that's a little outside of my current lane.
Yeah, open access publishing is definitely outside of my lane, but when I was reading the question in the Q&A, that's what I was thinking of. Like, I don't know enough. I know enough to know that I'd be wrong to speak to it. That's what I know. And so I don't want to say that that is the right answer for the person who wrote this question, but I do think it might, I'm sorry. I think it might be one resource for you is the open access publishing. And so I'm sorry, I don't know more, but I'm glad Toby spoke to it because you know more about it than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about open access. It's really becoming a dominant, it's really becoming dominant in Europe, the expectations around open access publishing. The journal I work with is moved into open access, is moving into open access. They're designating certain percentage of all publications as open access. And that's really coming from universities in Europe who are insisting that it be recognized by publishers, and that that authors be allowed to open, that authors be allowed to and are expected to open under open access guidelines. So, and I think that is also really beginning here in the US as well. Conversation around open access, you know, journal submissions and papers and even books. I think, you know, and this goes back to maybe another question or another issue that Toby raised about academic standards, right? Because we don't, in the US, we don't have, especially if you work in the humanities, there is not as much of a culture around open access publishing. And so that is something that has to shift within fields, within interdisciplinary and humanistic fields. You know, the sort of acceptance of open access publishing and open access, you know, manuscripts and outlets. You know, I think those standards are changing, but they are really driven on the ground at the department level by faculty. Ultimately, they're the ones that have to kind of decide that those are the standards for their interdiscipline or their field. That's what marks good scholarship. And so it's a complicated question in that sense.
I was looking at the next question and I'm wondering, is there a different peer review process for open access publishing, or is it the same or no?
It is for us. For us, everything gets reviewed the same, but some journal articles are designated open access. And generally what the publisher does is identify those articles that they think have the broadest appeal that people will want access to. And so they make those open access. You know, some journals handle it differently, but almost all open access is peer reviewed in some way. So that's one of the sort of misconceptions about open access publishing, is that it's not vetted in similar ways.
I just wanted to remind folks that I saw in the chat that there's going to be more in-depth discussion about open access publishing in the next panel. So, okay. So that's awesome because I don't know very much. But I also, Isabel, when you said about the problem with that this is particularly a problem in the humanities, it also reminded me that I think another thing we could do is to really support collaborative and co-authored work in the humanities that is still super dismissed in these fields and really undervalued. And I think that that also is one way that, you know, I have seen folks publish really amazing pieces that they co-authored with community organizers or activists. And so it becomes like a really good way to not just take someone's words and publish it under your own name, but actually to do it truly collaboratively with people that you work closely with. So, you know, I think there's a long way to go in humanities in particular in learning how to value collaborative research and publishing.
I completely agree, Toby. I mean, I think, you know, at the college, I get to look at people's CVs across the whole, you know, spectrum, social sciences and the sciences and the humanities and interdisciplinary units. And just about everyone but the humanities values collaborative publishing, not just, you know, with a broad range of collaborators. Some community partners, almost always an expectation that you're going to collaborate with the people you're mentoring. That's kind of an expectation of what they want to see as someone matures in their career. And that's very different from the humanistic approach of very much being like individual driven and individually focused research. You know, and I've always thought that was interesting and wondered why that is the case, that there's such a resistance to kind of thinking through different models of publishing in humanistic and interdisciplinary research.
That totally brings it to me, that brings it full circle to where I started with Linda Tupow-Smith's work on research and the emphasis, the sort of imperialist emphasis on the individual, right, and how that has driven so much research, that it's disappointing, to say the least, that that's still such a core value that's held in the humanities in particular, that it all comes down to like this idea of the individual on their own, right, when we know that all of our work is collaborative, even if it's only one person's name on the title. And so, yeah, I think that to me is just another vestige of research as a tool of colonialism and white supremacy, basically.
I saw the next question. And can everyone see the questions, or?
I cannot.
Oh, you can't? Okay, I'll read it. I'll happily read it. What advice would you give to a publisher that wants to include more voices that have been historically marginalized, particularly if you are advising authors to avoid university presses that don't already have a large backlist in those areas? I know for myself, like when we were looking for publishers, I know I mentioned that we were looking at their catalogs, but another thing we were looking at was the funds that would support the development of the book and access to those funds, because, you know, we have to pay for certain aspects of publishing, like image use of images and things like that. And so that was another aspect that we look at in publishing. is then the support that they would provide authors who identify as a person of color.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first publisher I worked with was NYU. And at the time I published my book with them, they did not have a deep Latino studies or critical feminist studies or critical media studies list at all. And those public and that publisher in particular just went full board aggressive recruiting authors that he wanted to include to build out that list for them, because they identified that as a key priority area for the published, for the press. And they made it financially possible to publish with them. That is, they had no expectations that I had to come up with any kind of financial contribution to publishing the book. They said, if your university offers it, wonderful, but we're going to publish it regardless, right? And I think that financial barriers to access is one key way to not diversify your press.
Someone had mentioned in the chat, and I think this is, it sort of dovetails with this, regarding like open access publishing in the humanities, and how, there's a lack of funds to sort of offset the costs that publishers, basically require for open access work. And that's something like I've been recently trying to learn more about open access, because I'm working on an edited collection that will have like a whole slew of contributors, and like open access publishing is really important for this volume and for many of the folks who are contributing to it. So like I've been learning about like just the costs that are associated with that, and there are so many costs that are associated with publishing in different ways. So I think these are really, really important questions. There's a lot of assumptions too that I think are made about, like faculty and folks who are working at universities, like, oh, like you can pay for all these things and then just be reimbursed later and that kind of stuff. And that's not, there are a lot of folks who, might be first generation, college graduates, or, folks with, working class backgrounds who don't have like deep pockets and to be able to do that kind of stuff. So that's a really important issue, I think, across the board.
Yeah, who aren't at those institutions that have financial resources. I will say that's one of the things that really strikes me as, I'm not as familiar with open publishing or open access publishing in the US as I am in the European context, because the publisher I work with is a British press, a British publishing house, and they pay for journals cover the cost of open access publishing, and some universities, some departments at UK universities require that their authors publish open access. So if you can't guarantee that their work is going to be open access, it's not going to help them with promotion or advancement. And that I don't think is the model here. And I think it's a really, what it pushed is the publisher I was working with, it pushed them to provide resources for open access publishing, because they had to, it's the only way they could ensure that they could meet the expectations of some of the universities in Europe towards open access publishing, or having their scholars, published, but only through open access. So it's, I have to assume that that's a conversation that's going to have to happen in the US.
I really hate to interrupt this amazing conversation, but we're actually past time and we've got the next session starting in just a few minutes. This has been amazing, and I'm so grateful to all of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you've provided an amazing segue to the next session on publishing. So we'll sign off for now, and I hope everyone will stay around for the next panel. You have to log off this session and then click on the link for the next session, Opening the Blinds. So thank you, everybody, and we hope we'll see you in the next session in just a couple minutes. Thanks.